Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, today someone requested that I speak about grief and mourning, which seems an apt topic for this period and this year. I think many of us have either lost someone close to us or watched those near us go through a lot of difficulties in 2020. So this is always a relevant topic, but perhaps it's especially appropriate now. I think approaching this through the lens of the Four Noble Truths is simplest. And the Four Noble Truths, once again, frequently get taught as, I think badly, as ontological statements about reality, like life is suffering, and so on. But in reality, I think it's much more useful to look at the duties that the Buddha spoke of in regards to each truth, what we're supposed to do with each truth. So the first noble truth is one is supposed to fully comprehend dukkha, or suffering, stress. The second noble truth, that one is to abandon its cause, its craving. The third, that one is to realize the cessation of dukkha, peace. And the fourth, that one is to cultivate the path to that cessation. And that's the Noble Eightfold Path. The Buddha spoke about two of his teachings being categorical, meaning that they could be applied in every circumstance. That's the four right efforts, which we won't go into now, and the Four Noble Truths. So this framework is always appropriate to look at things through. And in the end, at the higher levels of realization, I mean, the Buddha was very clear, this framework will take you to enlightenment, to full purity of heart. And eventually, one sees the aspect of suffering in many, many things in life. And what we see it in does change as we practice. But I do think that the particular depth of grief and suffering that we are describing when we speak about grief and mourning and deep loss deserves its own conversation and its own vocabulary. So this first directive of turning towards our suffering, of fully comprehending it, is radical, because there's no neutral stance to suffering. It's the nature of suffering that either we are running blindly away from it or turning consciously, deliberately towards it to understand it. There's no middle ground in that respect, which is why I think the Buddha places it foremost in, or the first of the truths, is because this is the first step, the radical pivot point of a life, and of the difference in a life between one of blind escapism and sensual dilution of our spirits and purpose is, and a life between that and a life of true purpose and courage and practice, is the decision of whether or not to turn towards and try to look at the suffering which we all bear as our inheritance into this world. And there was a story that a teacher named Frank Ostakowski tells, where he was speaking about the Four Noble Truths, specifically the first, at a Dharma group in Idaho. And one of the participants chimed in and said, "Oh, it's like telephone poles." And he was confused and so asked about this. And the man said, "I used to work installing telephone poles, and they're right when you put them in, they're very unstable and can fall anyway. And your first instinct is to run. But the foreman told me that what you need to do if the pole begins to fall is get right up next to it and put your hands on it, because then you know and can feel it and know which way it'll fall, and that's the safest place to be." So the first noble truth in our suffering, it's the same. The only choice, the only place of refuge is to be right next to it uh, and trying to understand it, and that's the safest place. And Jung said that what we don't acknowledge becomes our destiny. And I know that it's true. These deep griefs in life, these deep traumas or losses, many of which might be from childhood, but some of which we encounter later in life now, all through life, they are so unbearable, some of them, if we don't have a practice, that we just block them out. And then they insidiously rule our lives. And one of my mother lost her parents when she was quite young, and you can see in the 1950s, people didn't talk about such things or sort of acknowledge grief in this way, and you could see how it echoed through her family and ripped many many people apart in certain ways or damaged them, and how the echoes of what we don't acknowledge continue. So this first prerogative of turning towards our pain is absolutely essential. And I think with grief and loss of substantial depth, then obviously we look at it as we do with all suffering in Buddhist practice. You know, you have a space every day you set aside to meditate in, and in this space you have a chance to sort of acknowledge and be with sadness and the pain that is part of such things. But also I think there is a strata of the human spirit that grief impacts, that takes a bit of skillful means to access and to heal. And I think that one of the ways that we have of turning towards our pain, of of depth, of really deep loss, is art, actually, and that there's a sort of Jungian substrate of who we are that's a bit below the verbal, and that the deepest traumas are sometimes stored and echo there. And that when one writes about something or paints or something, that actually it's a really powerful way to um, metabolize grief and uh, store create a story into something else, and it can serve as the crucible in which grief turns into um, purpose. And I'll go into that in a second. But yeah, I don't think it's any, accident, for example, that Dante was guided down into the depths of hell by Virgil, a poet. And no one ever feels worse about something after writing about it. It's always a good thing. So I really think that there's a place in deep grief for writing or painting or something, some way of uh, letting it out, and that this is a great way of actually turning towards suffering because art ennobles our suffering, and that ennobling lets us look at it. And I think that's actually one of the great gifts of the Western tradition is that it's become one of its main means of looking at and dealing with pain has been to ennoble it through art. And you see the beauty of that in, the most powerful liturgy of, Catholicism. Or I've heard someone say that the great gift of Christianity was to aestheticize suffering. So I think it's a skillful means, and I certainly have found it important. And the other means I think that is helpful is ritual. And this is a great loss in our culture, is we've lost most of the ways we have of grieving through ceremony and of honoring the dead. And these embodied movements and ways of, say, acknowledging a loss can be very cathartic and sustaining and really hold the sort of delicate and trembling creature of deep pain. It sort of is it can be the container for it to hold it long enough that we really can be with it and look at it, but that it needs that structure. So, simple ways of keeping a candle burning for someone who's passed for a long time, for weeks, months, with a picture. In Thailand, they have ceremonies of at funerals where they'll dedicate goodness towards the dead and for the dead for the first 7 days after a passing, and then after 100 days, and then again after a year. So these ways of recollecting and allowing ourselves to look to our suffering and turn towards the First Noble Truth with the assistance of these structures. And I think that if one is encountering true grief, then having some sort of ritual or ceremony is important, a way of honoring the dead. So the second noble truth is craving, is to abandon the cause of our suffering, namely craving. And I don't know quite how to spend too much time on this duty with regards to deep grief, except that when we lose someone close to us, I think it can be important before that happens and after to look at how much of our love is us feeding or depending on another for our own well-being, as opposed to true liberative love, a deep love that we give. And that by parsing those two out and really trying to cultivate in our lives Not that we don't have attachment, not that we don't honor our family and loved ones with that bond, but that there can be a slight stepping back from a sort of white-knuckled clinging to another for one's well-being, and that when one steps back just a little bit, that actually it opens up a space for a much deeper love to enter that allows someone and grants them and encourages them in their freedom. And this does not require celibacy, a life of being alone, nothing like that. Just acknowledgement of and cultivation in our lives of a refuge within ourselves, and that when one begins to practice and cultivate that refuge, that one finds that when things inevitably change and we do inevitably lose those we love, or those we love change and become other than we would like them to be, then we don't need to control them. And then grief is allowed to manifest as a poignancy and a deep intimacy, even with that aspect of life, but that it doesn't have to manifest as the painful and controlling tearing of a bond we feel like we will be bereft without. And if we can cultivate such a refuge within ourselves, then the gift we give those we love is all the more potent for that. Because we allow them to be as they are. And they can sense that they are not any longer our source of identity or well-being, that they don't need to act a certain way for us, but rather that we are giving them something because we have a wealth, an inner wealth to give. And that then also when loss does come, that it doesn't destroy us. So this is essential to cultivate. And I'd say that it speaks to the third noble truth, which is the cessation of craving or suffering, which is peace. And that if we can cultivate a space of quiet and love in our lives, a sense of purpose and refuge, that this is a great boon, and perhaps our only way of really dealing with suffering, with deep loss that life inevitably brings. Which brings us to the path, the fourth noble truth, which is to develop the path towards that cessation. And this truth for me is the most perhaps interesting here to speak to, because there are so many ways in which we can speak about developing this refuge in ourselves. One of the most basic, but perhaps the most important, is just the sense of well-being that comes from a well-developed meditation practice. That if we do have access to the sense of refreshment and well-being and stillness that comes from becoming skilled at mindfulness of breathing, or metta meditation, loving kindness, where we have access to a deep wellspring of happiness and the mind can grow bright all on its own, then it sounds like a very practical and simple thing, but that general changing of the tenor of our lives over a long period of time makes us much more resilient to grief and allows us to no longer cling to others with a tight-knuckled grip because we have another source of happiness. And then when they go and when they change, we aren't left with nothing. And this is important. The Buddha spoke about 3 levels of happiness. One was called worldly happiness, amisa sukha, and it is the happiness dependent on others, on sensual pleasures, on others meeting our demands for them, treating us like we want to be treated. The second level of happiness is niramisa sukha, or I'd call it otherworldly happiness, spiritual happiness or well-being, which is the happiness that comes from internal qualities like unification of mind, meditation, morality, just the sense. And then the third level of happiness is that of nibbana, or complete security and enlightenment. And these levels of happiness are distinguished in part by how delicate and fragile they are. Those the sense of well-being we have that is dependent on external conditions is extremely fragile because we do lose those we love, and they do change, and things do not go as we would like. So what the path allows us to do is cultivate this second level of happiness, niramisa sukha, spiritual happiness, where we become sensitive to these inner qualities, which are something that is not delicate. They are, in the end, subject to changing conditions internally, which is why they aren't equivalent to that third level of happiness or of nibbana or peace. But they are much more secure. Just the sense of keeping, say, the 5 precepts purely. And there's a phrase in the suttas, one becomes sensitive to the pleasure of being blameless. And I think we've all had that experience of beginning to hold ourselves to these ethical standards of not ever killing, of not ever lying, of not ever taking what is given. And the sense of wholesome pride, of light that comes from that is a genuine resource for us. And similarly, these sense of well-being that comes from meditation is a similar one. And this speaks to another element of how we cultivate the path in a way that lets us confront and be with true loss, is that in Thailand, part of the ceremony of ways of honoring the dead is to give and recollect and dedicate that giving to those who have passed. And when Thai villagers give on alms round, what they are praying for when they do is those who have passed, they're dead. And this is a great loss in the West, is that we've forgotten our dead. And in almost every culture there have been ways of recollecting and bringing them to mind, and of doing good in a way that acknowledges them. And that if we do make a regular practice of recollecting those who have passed, and of dedicating goodness to them, and of bringing them into acts of goodness, then we change our relationship to their memory, and it becomes, we recollect the good that was there more than just the loss. And this is the beauty of dana, of giving, why it's the first paramita, the first spiritual perfection on the list of 10, is that it's a very simple and practical and robust way of brightening the spirit, because we are not strong enough to deal with the tragedy of life on our own and as selfish creatures. Luckily, we don't have to be selfish creatures. We don't have to deal it with on our own because we have the Dhamma. And the more we give ourselves to that path, the more, in a very practical way, by giving, say, or by dedicating ourselves to meditation, to precepts, to a purpose and a goal which is higher than any of us individually, then the more we enter into a sense of being held by the stream of Dhamma, the more we enter into a sense of harmony with the greater resonance of the Dhamma below the surface of life. And that I think we have, most of us, that experience of, as we practice more and more, we have the sense of something taking us and guiding us, and of a greater hand coordinating our movements in line with what is truly beautiful. There's a story I remember of Kafka, and he encountered a girl who'd lost her doll in a park. And instead of telling her the doll was lost, he said that maybe the doll had gone traveling. And for the next few years, he wrote her letters from the doll's travels. Wherever it went, the doll would send little letters to the girl from Paris or Spain and tell her about her travels. And then when the girl got to a certain age, a new doll showed up on her doorstep, given by Kafka. And the girl took it and put it in her room. And years later, she found something she'd missed, which was that in the doll's hand, Kafka had left a note. And the note said, you will lose everyone you love, but the love will always come back to you in new forms. And I think this is something we can depend on as we cultivate this goodness, is that we will lose a great deal in life, and we will encounter great tragedy. And if we seek refuge in this world, completely depending on it, we will be disappointed. But if we seek refuge in a higher purpose, if our goal in life transcends just fleeting sense of well-being, and if the world is taken as a lesson and tragedy is taken as something which is meant to shape us into a better tool to serve others, then we can bear life. And I think these aren't just words. When we really lose, it is what makes us open to compassion. The beating that a heart takes when it is confronted with true loss. If we can move through it, if we can look to it as we're told to in the First Noble Truth, if we can find resources to sustain ourselves through that, then what we become shaped into by loss is a vessel of that can help others, that can hold a greater love. Frank Ostakowski, the teacher I was referencing earlier, also speaks, he works as a Zen chaplain in hospice, and one of the people he worked with was a woman who lost her child uh, when he was a toddler. And the one thought she had coming back from the hospital was that she couldn't let this destroy her. And what sustained her afterwards in her life was dedicating it to not just working with the dying, but when there were parents who had lost a kid, who'd lost a child, the hospice administrators would call her because she was the only one who could understand, and she was the only one who could help them. And this is an extreme example, but I truly believe that if we can look to the inevitable tragedy that life will bring as something meant or something that can help shape us into something more fit to love others. And not that this justifies the suffering, not that it negates it, not that one is supposed to just use this as a quaint phrase to spiritual bypass, just that we do lose people. And that this path offers us a way of being even with the deepest levels of loss that allows us purpose and therefore allows us to become better suited to the world, to serve the world. And I think that the sense of purpose that the Dhamma gives us allows us to move through that dark valley. And the community we have in each other as practitioners on this path does as well. And for me, I think that sense of purpose is perhaps the most powerful of all of these, because so many of the other aspects come and go. But one thing the Dhamma has never left me without was a sense that this path leads a life towards a destination truly worthy, that a life is not wasted the more it's given to this. So there's a poem that one of the few I've actually memorized, but I think it speaks to this most powerful of points for me. So I'll give it a go. It's called The Journey by Mary Oliver. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, and you felt the familiar tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late and a wild night, and the road full of fallen sticks and stones. But slowly, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice that you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save.